She wrote yesterday that she will reschedule something in order to be able to participate here, but maybe it didn't go. And I'm sure that there are quite, so my partner would be interested in the recording, for sure. He's working now. Another friend of mine couldn't do this evening, but would be interested in, and then probably Ellie as well. So it's not a big circle, it's just a close.
Well, so it's interesting to meet you, and it's interesting to sort of have that conversation with you, because it's something which I'm really interested in, and I think I'm not quite sure who I'm trying to talk to, and you know what I mean, like just to find because I think we have to explore these ideas and take them forward, and you know, sort of now's the time, sort of thing. And so I'm a permaculture teacher in general, one of the things that I do, and so I've got lots of kind of lectures and things that I use to open up subjects and start discussions and things with groups, and it's always in a context of a wider context, which is always about ecology. We live on, we're part of a living planet, an ecosystem. We're only part of that, and every interaction that we make shapes it, in some ways changes it. You know, we're like the same permaculture, everything gardens, everything is, if you like, making choices that affects the environment around it, and it's the sum total of that is the world that we live in. And I think we've got to go through a paradigm shift to get to that way of thinking. And so in its simplest way, because we live in this world that's governed by economics. What is that even? You know, we've these financial forces. What is money? Is, you know, at the end of the day, these are very, very powerful forces, but they're not well understood. And I think that we've all lost the narrative somehow. So I'm trying to sort of find a way through all of those kind of ideas with this talk. So economics, in a simple way, we could define it as how we decide to allocate resources. So this is the first rule in permaculture, first ethic in permaculture, is the realization is that our first thing that we have to do is to meet our own needs. You've got to feed yourself and be warm and clothed and rested to be able to contribute to society, or be able to contribute, you know, to take care of yourself and to take care of other people. So how do we allocate the resources that we have around us to enable us to meet our needs? That's our primary thing. Okay, so economics is, I guess, is a process of trying to understand that process. Simple as a simple definition. Whatever, it's been said by many people, but is we have all the resources to make a utopia. Why is it that we've created something that's an absolute nightmare? And in many ways, it's because we've allowed ourselves to be led by the wrong people, or we're using the wrong decision-making process. We're using these tools, economic tools, to make decisions about how we allocate resources. But yet the decision that we make is, well, let's have another war and let's carry on running down the environment rather than transitioning to a sustainable economy. There's something wrong. There has to be. There's something that isn't fulfilling our core long-term needs. So this, I'm going to pretend I'm really knowledgeable, and I'm not. This is the floor plan of a typical Athenian home in, you know, like the Greek high period of whatever that was, 300 or 400 BC. And imagine a house laid out around function, more than ostentation and, you know, looking big and important. And also think about a house as a household. Maybe it would have been, you know, multiple generations and aunts and visitors and travelers and merchants and servants and, you know, whatever. That people wouldn't have traveled around in cars, so they would have, when you visited someone, would stay a few days. You know, it'd be kind of think of a household like that. So, and then it's a very, very simple economy about how you allocate space, allocate resources, and make decisions, arrange things so that you can meet needs and have these sort of important social functions, whatever they might have been back in ancient Greek times. But this is kind of interesting. So we've got a central courtyard. Imagine this is like, it looks like there's probably cloisters or columns or something, and a shaded courtyard, maybe with grapes, and who knows, you can just imagine, maybe it was a nice, cool, shady place. The Ziziniek, maybe, I don't know, I'm attempting to pronounce that, I have no idea. Wonderful word. But can you imagine that space in the middle of the house would it be where everybody would have congregated, or you would have crossed paths with the men with the women and the servants and the visitors and the salesmen and what have you, tradesmen coming to the house. You might have all interacted with each other there. So it's a very important part, a function within society where we all need to kind of interact with each other. But as also is, we all need special spaces, if you like, allocated where other specific functions can go on. So I don't pretend to understand all this, but it just seems to be interesting that it's a rational allocation of, we've got a certain amount of space. So we'll have these Scipioni, these rooms would be where visitors and people passing through would stay. They're more like sort of public areas and not so much the private home. And they all open out onto the courtyard. So you can see how all of that is sort of functional. And then here, the Andrion, these would have been rooms for men. And I don't know whether the things men would have done in those spaces, but maybe it was about security or, who knows, we can just speculate. And again, all of those spaces all open out onto this central courtyard. So you can have a mingling of societies, separation of function. So there's an allocation of resources to fulfill function. And maybe this front part of the house, I'm just speculating now, but this front part of the house seems to be more private. It doesn't open out onto the central courtyard. And we've got the Andrion, we've got another male space, so maybe where the head of the household or whatever might have held court, something. And the Gynecium, which obviously would have been female spaces, maybe child rearing and who knows what, all those kind of functions that we associate traditional female roles might have happened in those spaces. And what we're left with is, this is what's really interested me, is this last room, which is the oikos. And the oikos was the kitchen. The oikos was the hearth. And so decisions and actions happen at the hearth, which affect everything within the household. It's about obviously nourishing and feeding everyone in the household. But also the decisions that you make within the oikos about where you buy your food from, where it comes from, and whether you grew it or whether you stole it from someone else, that affects the outside world. So there's a really interesting interface there where, if you like, this sort of functioning household speaks to the outside world, and there's decisions made in the oikos shape both the hearth, the home, but also the outside world. So you could say that word oikos, which is kind of the actually equivalent to household, house, or family. But I think it's more than that. I think it's the hearth, and it's also the idea of the decisions that are made around that. So it's something that's much more interactive. Think how important a kitchen would be in a traditional household like that. So oikos, this word is the root for both ecology and economics. So it's also an idea of thinking about systems. And ecology is a whole bunch of different species interacting with each other in a way and creates a sort of self-regulating, balancing state. And economics is also how lots of little independent producers and consumers and all trade with each other to help meet our needs. We're never going to be self-sufficient because there's too many skills you need to make shoes or medicine or grow food or as we know. So it's an absolutely a human thing is to create like market economies where you swap your darning skills for my whatever fermenting skills or something like that. So think about so this again, this oikos idea to me is all about relationships, active two-way relationships. Think ecology and think a kind of small village market economy. And I think those are the models that we have to hold and understand that that's what this word originates from. So if economics is about management of home and complex this sort of going those kind of processes that we're saying, there's another word I've never seen it really used other than just in a textbook, but chrematistics, the making of money, the pursuit of wealth, the science of the study of wealth. That seems to be what we've got confused by. And in what we think, studying what we think economics is about making money and creating wealth and so forth, which it actually isn't. We're going against the very definition of the word. We're stuck in a world of chrematistics, where we're obsessed with numbers and future values and stuff, and somehow we've forgotten that the function of economy is to help everybody meet their needs with the available resources. So so there's all these kind of basic economic questions about is, even if I'm a farmer and I've got a field, what do I plant in it? Am I planting carrots or potatoes or carrots or parsnips? If I'm a baker, should I make white bread or brown bread? And what's the right price to sell it for? You can start to think about. So we started having market interactions. You're swapping your skills for my skills or labor or whatever it is. That we have to try and find values, and we have to discover what the value of something is, and that's an interesting process. Okay, so again, it's sort of economics 101. And if you the most interesting, detailed, and informed critique of capitalism is Das Kapital, written by Karl Marx, which I have not read. I only know bits of it. I mean, I'm not pretending to be some huge, great scholar. But what really is clear about that is money is nothing. Money is completely ethereal. We're going to sort of think more differently about what money is and stuff, and why it is that governments and things don't necessarily matter if sort of pound coins, notes disappear, because they can always create some more. And essentially, in the classical economic theory, now we're in a new era now, but classic economic theory is, so wealth, money, is derived from the factors of production: land, labor, and capital. So we've got to bring together physical resources, whether it's coal out of the ground or tilling the soil or felling the lumber, to use labor to refine those into products, which we can sell, obviously using knowledge and skills, all of those things which loosely get called capital in economics. And that obviously creates products and services which then can be sold. And we've through this sort of market economic system, we've created this idea of creating products and services which we sell for profit, and we take that profit and we reinvest that back into the process again. And all of this makes a lot of sense when you start in a smaller scale. And again, so at the heart of market economics is this very, very simple idea about supply and demand. So this is about price discovery, and also is, how do I know, if I'm a baker, how do I know how many loaves of bread to sell and what to sell it for? And obviously it's a complex thing. There's a lovely anecdote from the 70s. I don't even know whether it's exactly true or not. I think there's a Labour government. I think some Soviet visitors came over and some kind of, entente cordiale, whatever, cultural exchange. And just making, small talk, one of the Soviet visitors said to the British politician is, so who's the Minister of Bread for London? As in, how do you make the decision to, how to know how many loaves to make? And of course, under the Soviet system, it was a centrally planned economy. It wasn't market forces that were giving people the decisions. It would, a bunch of people would sit in their Politburo and think, everybody needs 400 grams of bread a day. That translates to so many hectares, which means we need to build so many tractors and combine harvesters and plant so many, so on and so forth. To do it is a big mathematical computation, which of course, there's so many variables in that you can't possibly ever get it right. So, and of course, there is no Minister of Bread for London. And that's kind of the joke is how do they know what bread to produce? And it's because of the market mechanism. And the market mechanism, in its essence, in its purest form, is genius. And it's the kind of the thing that we can't afford to throw out. There's an expression, to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I don't know. I'll expand on that a little bit because I think it's important. But obviously, the problem with everybody talks about free market and the importance of the market is there is no free market. It's a complete lie as well. It doesn't exist. So With the free market, you can't have health and safety or child regulations or whatever. We can go into that, but I mean, they bailed the banks out. That's why we know there isn't a free market. They've broken all their own rules. But we'll come to that, and that's why we've got into such an appalling mess. So yeah, the difference between command economies and planned economies. You can have central governments trying to figure things out and order diktats, or somehow we can let this magnificent, what Adam Smith called the invisible hand of the market to steer us. So literally a farmer knows how many proportionate carrots to parsnips he needs to sow, she needs to sow. So here's the basic principles of market economics. This is what shapes kind of everything, although it doesn't. But there's two universal truths, and the first one is the up-sloping supply curve, which is, we've got two axes there, price and quantity. So if you're a hairdresser or you're someone who's making cakes for a living, and the price of that commodity rises, you have more incentive to make more, to put in more hours because you're being paid more. And that's a kind of assumption that's sort of market economics takes that as being a kind of a universal truth, that the higher the price of something in the market is, the harder we'll go to supply it. And of course it's not always true. There's lots of examples where that's not true, but in essence it is. So if we pay people more, they'll work harder, sort of thing. Or it's not actually the right thing. Is the higher the price the market is prepared to pay for something, the more you're motivated to produce it. So in other words, I know if they're going to pay more for the carrots, I'm going to plant more carrots. And the other universal kind of truth is that there's a downward sloping demand curve. So, and that means simply is, as the price for something rises, you're less likely to buy it. If that's true for like a loaf of bread, it's not true necessarily for diamonds or for property in London. But so these rules aren't universally true. But in principle, this is the basic principle that market economics is based on. And obviously it's the interaction of these two things, because what happens is, the price moves up and down, wiggles around, and at some point, in principle, the market reaches some kind of equilibrium. And this is price discovery. This is where we find out exactly what is the right price for a carrot today and the right price for a parsnip today. And those are very, very useful things that allow, obviously, exchange to happen. And we always need that to happen. So again, behind the kind of free market idea is the principle then is that you can link what used to be little local markets, people selling cabbages and tomatoes in their local markets. You can link these across these global exchanges and through global trade, and we can create global markets of products. And actually, it's very important not just to know the price of something today, but to have a guess at what the price of something, the value of something is going to be tomorrow. So the other thing that happens there is people hedge their bets. They take little gambles about what we think tomatoes might cost tomorrow, and that helps, in principle, average out prices, and it stabilizes the system, in principle. Okay, so you know all of this really anyway, I'm sure. This is just going right back to the beginning. But this sort of free market ideology is based on a set of assumptions which are not, we all know to not be true. For example, in no particular order, is that consumers always make rational decisions. You always buy the cheapest thing because, and also because you have all the right information. That companies have full disclosure. They tell you so you understand the difference between products, or that all products are the same. So the difference between one loaf of bread and another loaf of bread might not just be the price. It might be one's organic, or one's being marketed more aggressively, or it's associated with a movie or something. And also the free market based on the assumption that there's no barriers of entry and exit to the market. So if carrots are very expensive, it's very easy for lots of new carrot growers to get busy with their thing. And so and that's another thing which is happening now more and more, is things are being stifled with an intellectual property. We're creating huge, what they call oligopolies, these huge monopolistic markets, which you can't get in and out of because the barriers to entry are too high. So there's lots of things. So the market performs an essential function about allocating resources and helping make decisions. But the problem is it's completely corrupted by sort of incorrect assumptions. So we have to think about, if we're going to come up with a better model, we've got to be aware of all of these shortcomings. I think that's what I'm saying. I love to have fun with students about really challenging them to think about what is money. And sometimes I get pieces of paper and just draw my face on it and put 20 on it and kind of argue that, you know, why is my piece of paper any different from the Queen's piece of paper? And obviously that's bring to the idea in is that this form of money that we've got used to, notes and coins and sort of bank balances, it's fiat money, what they call fiat money, which means it has no value. It only has value because the government tells you it has. And the government also then has the freedom to, the ability to tell you that it doesn't have value. And we saw, I think it was in Cyprus, the government withheld people's deposits. It's happened before. So this money, it also belongs, at least 90% of all the fiat money that's in circulation has been loaned into existence by banks, which means that people having to pay interest for that money to continue existing. So what's really interesting is what's happening in the financial collapse 2009 was loads and loads of debt went bad, which means it couldn't be paid back, which means that money was destroyed. And it's an interesting thing is just to think about how much money they've printed, this quantitative easing, that created trillions of dollars to reinflate the economy. Now that should have created massive inflation, and it hasn't. And it's because all that's gone is to offset all of this money that's been destroyed by loans going bad. So we've created this illusionary world, which is not based in any kind of reality, and we're trying to use that set of tools to solve the problems that we currently have. So it's not surprised that it's not working. I don't know if you've ever read this book. This is a bit more thoughts about money. Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein, who's a science fiction writer in the 50s and 60s. It's a story of the first human mission to Mars. And they sent a family, a mother and father, maybe she was pregnant, had a baby or something. And when they arrived on Mars, because it takes a couple of years, however long to get there, the spaceship crashed and their mother and father sadly died. And the baby was rescued by the Martians and brought up as a Martian. So although it was hence Stranger in a Strange Land, he's a human, but it's never been to Earth and only understands Martian culture. And in Martian culture, the highest thing that you can do is to share water with someone. Water is the most precious and scarce resource. They value it above all else. And whatever sort of, you can imagine rituals around that would have been sacred to them. Anyway, the Martians decide that the stranger needs to go back to Earth and experience being a human on Earth. And so the whole book is about the perspective of a human, but who's never arriving on Earth and trying to make sense of it, trying to look at our crazy, mad world and trying to make sense of it. And obviously, he's utterly appalled about everything that we do about water and toilets and pollution and rainwater, culverts and everything about the way that we use water is utterly appalled, which makes you think natural resources actually nothing more valuable. There's nothing more valuable than water. That is actually, correct. Anyway, so it's shifting that perspective of thinking about from value to resource, which is different. And the other thing that I remember from the book from years ago, which I enjoyed most, which was he couldn't understand money. He was absolutely fascinated by money and realized that it was really significant, but he just couldn't, get a handle on it because it was such an abstract concept to an alien. And what he observed was that human beings circulated these pieces of paper between each other, and that somehow told them what to do. It gave them packets of information then told them where to go and what to do. Utterly fascinated by that. And I started to think about, let's think about money as information, the function that it performs. Because remember, it's just made up pieces of paper and notes on a computer. It's not a real thing, but it fulfills a function. So that's what we need to understand to get to the next level of sort of the next economic paradigm. So this is the waggle dance. And this is what a bee does when it arrives back at the hive and it's had a successful forage and it's found some lovely nectar-laden flowers. And it waggles, it does a dance in a particular pattern that describes an angle and a distance. And that says, hey, there's some really good food a quarter of a mile south-southwest in bee language. The currency, so the currency in the bee world is sugar, it's honey, it's nectar, it's honey. And honey is a stored form of energy. So honey effectively is the currency of money in the world of bee land. And think about, they create this sort of treasury of in their hive, and then there it is to nourish them and, you know, support them through thick and thin. So it functions as a kind of a money for them. And the information of where to get it essentially is that waggle dance is fulfilling the same function as what we do when we exchange those pieces of paper with each other. We're actually instructing with each other, you know, go over there, it's a quarter of a mile, pick up those things and bring them over here and stick them there. You know, and as a result, that creates a store of energy which our society can thrive off. So so money is information, and money is facilitating the function of us meeting our needs. That's what it needs to do. At its sort of core, I think that, and yeah. So clearly, money does more than it. So if money is information, money is a made-up thing, but and the reason we've made it up, and the reason why it does actually work pretty well, is because it fulfills useful functions that we need in, you know, on a day-to-day basis. So if money didn't exist, if let's say the global economy ended tomorrow, and actually this has happened in countries like Austria and Germany after the Second World War, suddenly their money is completely valueless. And but you know, the next morning your chicken lays an egg, and you have an egg, and you can exchange that, and you can go and use that effectively as a unit of exchange. Very useful, an egg. So even though money's completely disappeared, we've recreated it again the very next day by having something that has, but actually it's now not a fiat form of money, it's an actual thing. It's a commodity because you can actually eat it as well. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, but it's money's very useful because it allows us to facilitate exchange. Back to the simple market economy. It's a unit of account. So I can remember, oh, you owe me £3 and you can pay me, you know, whatever it is. We can keep measurements. It's a store of value. So that's where egg as currency breaks down, is they don't last very long. They go off. You can't save them for, you know, 5 years time for your retirement. But we need some kind of way of measuring and holding value over time, and also a way of method of deferred payment, allowing people to, if I borrow some money to buy some seeds and then next year I can pay that off by selling my crops, I need some way of facilitating that. And first of all, to use money in the marketplace, it needs to be divisible, durable and portable. So yeah, all kind of, yeah. So I'm kind of interested in this idea that, so if we can create something that fulfills those functions, then we've created our own form of money. And again, is maybe just stepping back from just thinking about money as notes and coins, but thinking about money as the information that facilitates people meeting their needs. Because that's what we need to do. And in many ways, the reason why we're finding that difficult is because we don't own the factors of production. We might be the labor, we don't have access to the land and the capital. As we move into, you know, going forward, it's interesting that we're moving to a world also of, I mean, there's a lot of intellectual property and patenting, but we're also moving to a world where a lot of information is just freely available. And if we move into kind of a global commons, so that sort of we have access to knowledge and information and the freedom of people to move around, then, I don't know, we're beginning to have more opportunities. But again, getting ahead of myself. So, I mean, just, I don't want to go too deeply into the whole money thing, but it does really interest me, and I think it is. So, that's a Roman silver coin. So that's where money actually, different kind of money, like an egg, it's a commodity, it's a thing, and it has an intrinsic value. Whereas our notes and coins only have value because the government tells us it has value. Of course, people used to slice that. Used to be what you'd have to weigh the coin to know exactly what it was worth and know the price of silver, and it got a little bit complicated. And people would chisel bits off and devalue them. So then, we had milled coins with milled edges and more sort of formalized types of money. And of course, there's examples of this all over history. But these tokens were to facilitate exchange more than this sort of stores of money, of value. And I like to, I don't know if you're familiar with what, I mean, so cryptocurrencies. Is this okay? Am I going too fast? Is this okay? Are we...
No, not too fast. I am familiar with the history of money and a little bit with crypto. Mm-hmm. What I don't get by crypto, maybe specifically by the Bitcoin, is this blockchain type of thing.
Okay, so that's, I use this story here, these few slides, to try and explain that, and sort of a bit about what the blockchain is. And so there's an island called Yap in the Pacific, and it's a coral atoll. There's no hard rocks on it. There's only coral, soft, crumbly rocks. And I don't know what happened, but someday some guy sailed 2 or 3 days away and came back on his boat with some hard stone that no one had seen before. And everyone said, oh, that's amazing. Obviously it would have created a discussion, and oh, look, Dave, or whatever his name was, has brought this hard stone back. And imagine a village community where everybody sits around the fire at night and tells stories and sings songs. So the story of Dave's rock enters the common knowledge of the village, and they sing songs about it. Well, and let's say I'm so fascinated with Dave's rock that I go over to see Dave the next day and I give him 2 chickens. I say, can I have your rock, please? So now that rock has become money and I've given it a value. So that's kind of what happened on Yap. So some other bright guy had the idea of jumping on his boat and her boat, whatever, and sailing over the sea and bringing back some more rocks. And they entered the economy. And these facilitated exchange. It actually enabled the communities to cooperate with each other more because they had these things entering the market as currency. And one day someone brought back a rock so big that it was hard to move. So when it entered I swapped it for a cow or something, but so when it entered the economy, they didn't bother moving it, they didn't bother holding on to it. It just entered the song that everybody sang around the campfires every night was, oh, that big stone that belonged to Dave now belongs to Steve. And that's now common knowledge throughout the whole community. It didn't need a bank to keep a ledger. Everybody knew that was because it's like a human scale society. And so then one more interesting thing started to happen was someone got halfway back with a boat heavily laden with rocks, and there was a storm and the boat sank. And luckily he was saved and got back to Yap. And those stones that were now at the bottom of the sea entered the economy anyway, because they'd been owned and claimed. And in the same way, people weren't really using the stones, they were using them as tokens. So the more they had these stones, the more it enabled more and more complex trade to happen on the island. And it facilitated, say a more interconnected kind of community. And then, of course, one day Europeans arrived and said, oh, there's loads of rocks over there, and it lost its value, and that was the end of that. So that little story in some way explains a little bit about what Bitcoin or what blockchain is that blockchain is the common knowledge that everybody knows that the stone that was mine now belongs to you, to say, and that because we've sang that song around the campfire, everybody knows it. And that information is being mirrored, and now it's sort of in the collective memory. So the blockchain is like a collective memory. Every transaction is reflected across the whole network and then kind of time stamped. So, and again, after the war, when a lot of economies had collapsed, people had no money, obviously in grinding poverty, people were building up from the bottom again. This is from Denmark, I think. But communities started producing their own money. Because in the same way as to say, well, we're all broke, no one's got anything, but my chicken's laid an egg, so that egg now becomes currency. I can give that a notional paper value, and that can now start to facilitate exchange in the community again. And I think what I've started to realize and what I've thought about this is that different types of currencies facilitate different types of transactions. And I think it would be really interesting to, again, it's to think about how, so if anybody, so this kind of currency is called a let's currency, a local exchange trading system. And again, some of these were so successful in the sort of 40s and early 50s that the governments allowed them to go ahead because it helped communities meet their own needs in a very basic way. But by the time the economies got started up again, the governments had to come and intervene and shut them down because they found them too hard to tax, as they weren't being controlled by a sort of central bank. So I think there's ideas in that might make us think, if when people talk about like what's going to happen, what's going to happen next, and there's going to be some kind of collapse, and what might that look like, and what might that feel for us? And I think, and obviously I have no idea, but from reading around, what sort of looking at past examples what it more looks like is a contraction, a very significant contraction in economy, maybe by who knows, by 2/3 or something like that. That we can't have this forever GDP expansion. Clearly that can't go on. And that when if that system breaks, then to buy things from Saudi Arabia, like oil, you're going to need US dollars. But to swap turnips and peas and cabbages with your next door neighbors, you could do that with a created currency. And maybe on a regional level, you could create your own kinds of alt currencies, and now with digital technologies, and you could create local blockchains and things like that. So you might be able to have a local currency that's pegged to a local cryptocurrency that maybe has then a relationship to dollars or pounds or to Bitcoin or something else. So I think there could be multi-layered types of economy, and that we could really explore to create different forms of money, like time banking, and there's many examples of how we might do that. So I think the whole Bitcoin story is really, really interesting. What people who know a lot more about it than I do say is this is the beginning of the next thing that happens, but this probably isn't the whole answer. This is the first attempt, and the second and third generation cryptocurrencies are kind of smarter and more interesting potentially. But Bitcoin's got the brand name, and it's the one that it's $50,000 a coin and what have you. So it provides a counterpoint to paper money, which could collapse. And another way to think about Bitcoin is it's more like the silver coin. It's more like a physical, tangible resource. Although it's digital, there's a finite number. There only ever will be, I don't know how many it is, 17 million Bitcoin. There'll never be more. And that's in the code of every one. But of course, each coin is infinitely subdividable. But there's a finite supply. So in some ways, we could think about it more like as a commodity, a bit like gold, and we find the value by supply and demand, good old market forces, just like we worked out the price of carrots and potatoes. So I think crypto is the beginning of a whole new next generation thing. And again, according to friends and stuff, is imagine the next generation really owning this, and the 25-year-old, whatever, sort of nerdy, smart people really understanding what you can do with blockchain. And so the real innovation is blockchain, not so much like different forms of currency we can explore, but it's this blockchain thing, because it creates a possibility for disintermediation. Like, it takes out the middleman. If I send you a check and you cash that check is you can only do that through a bank, through a middleman. If I send you a Bitcoin, you can spend that without that having to interact with any kind of other formal financial clearinghouse. And so it gives you a possibility for frictionless transactions that we can, there's almost no cost and no time restriction. Anyway, so I think it gives us a whole new world. Okay, so money's information, and I think we know. I talk a lot in the talk about market externalities, but obviously that's okay. The problem with this current system is that if money's information, and the decisions around money enables us to make decisions on how to allocate resources, and it's the pursuit of profit relates to the future planning and investment. So we're making long-term strategies ahead, but using kind of the pursuit of money and profit as a decision-making tool. And the problem with that is it tells us to do things like that, which is the Athabasca tar sands. That is called making money. Well, it's clearly not. That's asset stripping the environment of the biosphere, the thing that actually has value, and turning it into something which is polluting and destructive, and which we don't even need because we could have invested in solar and wind and what have you and gone in another direction. So that's what I mean by the system's giving us the wrong information. And it's because the feedback, the damage that this is causing is not going back and affecting the investors who are making the money. So this is what we mean by an externality is the cost of production that is not borne by the producer. And that happens in so many different ways. You can think about carbon pollution from and how that's affecting around the world. Obviously, the Pacific Islands disappearing underwater. However you want to visualize climate change, but they had was it a tornado, a hurricane? Whatever it was, the thing that just went through Kentucky this week. Just unbelievable. A 220-mile long scar across just devastation. That's a market externality. So we can actually say that climate change is the biggest market failure of all. And it's because we're making the wrong decisions. That the investors keep going, well, yeah, we'll have more of that because it's making my life nice. It's making everybody else's life terrible, but they're not experiencing it. And that's, again, nature runs on feedback loops. It needs to be, the consequences need to sort of inform the decision and shape the decision making. And this is the problem. This is a brand new funded hospital in Kiribati, paid for by United Nations. Isn't it fantastic? Underwater. So what good is that? And this picture just sort of illustrates the the counter. No, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. We're trying to help with one hand and we're accidentally destroying with the other. And this is a failure of our economic system. It's not telling us to do the right things. And whatever, cheap stuff, rubbish. I'll whiz through all of this, but what you kind of know is that we've had in this modern era, we've had this financialization of the economy. And as our economies now fail to grow anymore, we've now had to create different kinds of. What seems to have happened in the last 30 or 40 years is that companies, profit-seeking companies, borrow money, build things like cars to sell to consumers, to make a profit, to put back into their business again, is over time, they've stopped making a profit. And because we've sort of reached the end, we've reached all these market externalities and the rising costs of imports and saturation of markets. And so instead, we started to move into this financialized economy where we're now creating these hedge funds and future products and consolidated debt obligations and all of that is what led to the collapse of 2008-9, and it's we haven't learned any of those lessons, and we're heading back into that same kind of economic constriction as a result of that. And I'm sure you followed that story. It's actually, if you go back and look at it and realize exactly what happened and what they did and how it hasn't really changed, it really is quite shocking. There's a fantastic film. I just put the thing there for The Inside Job, but there's plenty others as well, which really explain exactly what they knowingly selling financial assets that had no value. Okay, so the final sort of bit, the sort of chapter of sort of, if you like, to bring us to the beginning of the conversation is, I'll take you to this model. It looks a bit scary and horrible and messy, but this is a step back from just a simple market economics idea. That actually, because all those individual markets with carrots and potatoes and things are all globally connected together, and this is the beginning now of more complex economic theory, which came with John Maynard Keynes, and it's what they call macroeconomics. And this is where it starts to look a little bit like an ecosystem again. So if you just forget all those words and what all those numbers and things might actually mean, is what it's making us realize is that everything's connected to everything else. And that there's a flow between things in the same way as there is an exchange of energy between fish and plankton and birds and whatever in an ecosystem. Is things are interacting in a way in which they create functional relationships. So so I'll pull this apart in a bit, and I like to. This is a very interesting book. This is quite old. This parts of this lecture. A guy called Richard Douthwaite, and I think if you were able to access it online for free. And he's someone who studied economics but became a journalist, and then later on wrote 2 or 3 very, very good books about economics. There's Richard Douthwaite. He passed away now, sadly. And this one, Short Circuit, is about short-circuiting global economies to create much stronger local economies. And he was someone who he lived in Ireland and was very close involved with things like credit unions, and could see how holding investment and helping communities to meet their own needs locally obviously has a multiplying impact on the community itself. So this book was quite influential in my thinking a few years ago, and he's written these other ones as well, but criticizing this idea of never-ending growth, and then also from an Irish perspective as realizing all the cheap EU borrowed money that kind of destroyed the Irish economy. So a very good critique of the whole kind of neoliberalism, really. And he talks about credit unions, and I'm gonna, maybe we can come back to some of these things, because I think some of these kind of, what he starts to think about there is to touch on institutions like cooperatives, credit union. So credit union is a bank that's managed by its investors, by its savers. So, and the problem, what Richard Douthwaite says in his books, is the problem with, so rural Ireland, people are genuinely quite conservative, and they'll save money and put a surplus in the bank. And what those banks do, like Barclays Bank, was they'll repatriate that money back to London or back to sort of global markets. It's very hard as a small business in Ireland to raise loans to meet local needs, because the banks will always seek customers that are, have a higher credit rating and, borrow larger amounts of money. So the problem that we have, one of the problems that we have, is that banks don't have our own interests at heart, that they're profit-seeking institutions that actually don't even really care about their customers. So things like credit unions, which, if a bank was managed by its own customers, then the chances are the bank would also want to lend to people just like us. So I've been involved in housing cooperatives for a long time, and something which would not have come about had we not joined a secondary co-op, a group called Radical Roots, which is just a network of other co-ops that between them have the knowledge of how to set up and run a co-op. And that information enabled us to go through a legal registration process, to access cheap finance, and to write business plans and get a commercial loan, where before we never would have managed to do that. And again, I think what Richard Douthwaite is saying in his book very much is if we can create more of these kind of social institutions that help communities meet their own needs, then that sort of can facilitate a sort of a renaissance of much more localized economy. So there are, for example, co-ops that help communities create a business plan to put a wind turbine in and then sell that electricity to off to the grid, or hydro, or insulation and solar. We could create institutions which enable tenants to actually own their own houses and become their own landlords. So there isn't the money the value that's been created within that is reinvested back into the thing itself. And this seems to be the key definition about not-for-profit and organizations in the social sector, is they can seek profit or have to seek a return, but the only thing they can do with that return is to invest it back into the same institution, and with the same values and the same objectives. So there's no point for housing co-op to charge a high rent, because any surplus, the only thing they can do is invest it back into the housing co-op again. So that makes it affordable. You're not seeking a profit which you're going to take away and spend somewhere else. So along the way, I've started to come across and really think about, and to a certain extent be part of, these kinds of, so we say, fully mutual institutions, things that help us create different kinds of outcomes, help us meet our own needs in different ways. So and for me, cooperatives is a very big part of that. This is the Co-ops UK website. We have a credit union in our county called Robert Owen Community Bank, and we have this wonderful bit of history that Robert Owen, 250 years ago, was born in Powys, Newtown, Powys. He was the guy who originated the world's very first mutual company. So that's something, again, I've thought about a lot. Anyway, so let's go back to our very simple macroeconomic diagram and think about how the economy works, and where we might better get involved in it to try and make it behave slightly differently. So on the one hand, there's households, that's you and me, sat at home, and then there's companies, there's the people who have the Findus fish cakes and peas and things that we need to eat, things that we need to survive. And we build relationships we sell our time onto the labor market, which in turn brings us money, and with the money we can consume the commodities that we need, which creates revenue for companies, which creates a demand for labor, which then builds relationship back to the households. So you can see that none of these things exist in isolation, and there's a relationship between them, and that the more activities is going on within it, the more goods and services are going to be circulating around. So our life might become more rich and interesting and better resourced. So the next thing is, of course, there's a government, and the government, to a certain extent, is facilitating and managing this process. And the government will take a tax from us, corporation tax or income tax, but also is that money's recirculated through grants and welfare and tax relief and stuff like that back into the economy again. So we've still got the economies, basically households and companies, but they facilitate through these other institutions slightly more complex layers of exchange, but they're all connected. And we've got banks, and obviously we can put savings and loans into banks, governments put savings into banks, and there's banks with the red lines there can lend money to companies, into households, and can invest in the development of providing more commodities. So there's the theory at the heart of it, and just think about these sort of dynamic interactions. So, and this is in part, this was the sort of austerity lie, if you like, or this is the thing that we're stuck with at the moment is, okay, how do we fix climate change? Can we afford to? Which again is a kind of a crazy question. We obviously need stable climate to survive, but where's the money going to come from? And of course, or when we were told that we had to pay for the financial collapse, the government was going to pull back on public services and welfare and investing in hospitals and public infrastructure because we've got to tighten our purse strings. But in reality is, what's happened many times in history is if governments spend money rather than, if governments withhold money, the economy shrinks. And if governments spend money by investing into households and companies and developing areas of the economy strategically, that money then circulates through households and companies. It doesn't go anywhere. It's within the system. So there's these kind of spurious arguments about whether we have the ability to get ourselves out of the holes that we're in, and we clearly do, but there's some big obstacles. And so of course our macroeconomic world, if that's the United Kingdom economy or whether it's the Llanrydder economy or whatever it is, whatever scale we're looking at it on, is obviously it still relates to the external world. And we've got exports and imports. So I ran out of space a bit there, but so we obviously, some things that we've produced we export, and we need materials and various things that we bring in from the outside, and somehow that system, that equation needs to balance. But we can think of it like an ecosystem. Everything's connected to everything else, and all these relationships, and we could fine tune and hone that system so it works quite well. But the problem is that these key institutions, the governments, the banks, the commodity exchanges, and so forth, they don't represent our best interests. They're like vulture capitalism. They're there to take advantage. And the problem is that this surplus is created, wealth is created, value is created by people working together, but that value is not reinvested into the community that created it. I always think of the old Welsh mining villages. You think of the millions and billions of value that's been created by all that coal's being taken out of the ground, but all you got left when it's gone is a closed pit and some sad little houses. None of that value was retained within the community. So that's the problem. And the more globalized the system is, the more we have that as a problem. So the wealth just tends to flow out of the system. So as governments get more powerful and greedy, they put more pressure on households through taxation and costs. Our money is essentially, if you like, sucked out of the local economy and somehow disappears off into the Cayman Islands somewhere. And they talk about the billions and billions of tax evasion by corporates, and that's because large companies are now obviously can be based across many different countries, and they can declare profits and so forth in those parts of the world. The offshore, what is offshore banking if it isn't piracy? If it isn't a legacy of the Spanish Main, going out and stealing your doubloons and burying them on in the Caribbean, like for a later date. There's a fundamental flaw within the system. There's multiple flaws, if you like. Going back to the beginning, is we're making decisions based on money and seeking profit and externalizing the costs of production. The more we can externalize the costs of production, the cheaper our products are, and therefore the more competitive we are in the market. So we're actually incentivized to do the wrong things by the market system. And we've always, in the past, we've argued that, well, you have a mixed economy, the government and regulators regulate the market so that the worst excesses are controlled. Well, we can see that over time, this is exactly what Karl Marx predicted, that this capitalistic system becomes more and more of an oligopoly with a few very big players that prevent freedom of movement in and out of the market, that suppress the flow of information, distort markets with advertising and by shutting down competitors and doing all of the things which actually break the rules of free market economics. So I think that I tried to come up with an opposite model, and not that it's a firm thing, but it's a fluid thing. But I think that these are the things that we should be thinking about and trying to create. And I think that this was a lot of what I got from Richard Douthwaite's book, was that maybe if we go back, simplifies it again, is let's have our households and businesses, but a much stronger local jobs market. And that might involve teleworking and stuff like that as well, but also actually interacting with your local community, so you actually know your neighbours, and and maybe at the heart of that, of our local localized economy, there's something that's more like a community bank, whatever that might be. I don't know what a community bank is exactly, but we could imagine with something that exists for the benefit of the community, a bit like the old building societies used to be. So the old building societies in the UK, they're all got names like Bristol and West and South Staffordshire and stuff. And it's because they used to be locally owned, and they would let people save up money and buy affordable housing. Back to that thing about big banks don't want to lend money to people like us, the people who, so we need to create institutions that favour the kinds of enterprises that we want to see in our community, and actually try and find ways to fund them. And that we could also create enterprises or whatever institutions that exist to help people form new co-ops, or to help people to begin to learn how to assemble these nuts and bolts to create new things. And I think that it's important for us to not go in thinking that we have the answers, but I sort of think for the next generation, and for the Greta Thunberg generation, or whatever the kids who are leaving school about now, is they should be given a free rein to explore and to create very different ways forward, because it's clear that all of this stuff that we've been doing all needs to end, and we need to come up with new models. It's not for our generation to define what those things are. I think the younger people have to understand what's important for them, but try out thousands and thousands of ideas, many of which will not be successful, because it's the only way you find the new way forward. That's what nature does. It tries every single option, find the ones that work. And I think that if there were sort of abilities to access resources and support at the heart of communities for people to start their own enterprises, start initiatives of whatever form that they feel is relevant, but they have to begin to address, obviously, this sort of social, financial and ecological crisis that we're all experiencing. So, and then we could create things like credit unions and maybe slightly more structured organizations that are there to allow people to make longer term loans and say build houses and start to make plans into the future, because we've been brought into a system where we're living month by month as well. And so to be able to address ecological challenges and social challenges, we need to have a plan much further ahead. So I'm just beginning to speculate. I don't know what exactly these institutions might look like or how they might come about, but I'm sort of think in some ways I've got to where I am so far by having help from definitely co-op support groups and community banks and also individual ethical investors. So like your community bank just stands, really is just the institution that stands in between the the investor and the borrower. And if instead of saying this model of when you put your savings into Barclays, but they're never going to lend that money back into your own community, let's create banks that would do that. And can we find ways to put value into that? And again, we could create economic tools like, say, things like energy co-ops. Is you can work out a simple calculation. If you have a certain number of a renewable energy installation, let's say, and you obviously do your calculations around that, and that makes a very safe thing to invest into, because you're going to produce electricity, you can sell it onto the grid, and a surplus created by that could go into these new kinds of institutions which enable people to get access to soft loans and start new businesses and things like that. We need some kind of income coming into that a community can decide how it's allocated, not central banks and not central governments. And I don't see why this type of system can't sit within, more national and international and global systems as well. So I kind of just imagine a system where you constantly work to reinforce these black lines so that these connections become stronger. And of course, you're still going to need to bring in resources from the rest of the country or the rest of the world, but less and less. Something I thought a lot about was when I first went to rural India, and you're kind of really psyched about the poverty and people are, you know, difficult, the simple lives that they live. And
can I try that?
Sure. Yeah, some rice to go with it.
Or no?
Yeah, just give it a good stir.
Okay, yeah.
And when you go into a local village, what you realise, you enter like into a local economy. And they have like these 1 dirham, 1 rupee notes, 2 rupee notes. They're circulated hands so many times every single day. They've got holes in them. They're almost worn away. And I was so surprised, these poor people living at a low level, but they go everywhere in a rickshaw and have a cup of tea made for them and go to a barber shop to get a shave, and everything's like 1 rupee, and you see the same rupee notes circulating around the village all day. And whereas actually nobody's saying the informal economy, no one's paying tax on that or keeping a regulation of exactly how many bananas they sold and what have you. So essentially that money's like a let's currency. It's a bit like the community sanction currency, and as long as everybody's sort of playing by the same rules, it doesn't really matter what the note is. You could have made it up, or it's arbitrary whether it's a 1 rupee or a 5 rupee. It doesn't actually matter because it's facilitating exchange. But as soon as that note goes out of the village, it never comes back, and then that's sort of the problem. So there you go. There's the beginning. Any questions? That's my big picture sort of thing, and that's what I've got this spider diagram in my head of thinking about what I think local economies need to look like, and with that, and to explore what these kinds of beneficial institutions might look like, and obviously it would be different from each community about exactly what they need. But one of the most interesting things that I've done in recent years was starting a community garden in Newtown in Paris, which is a town with a certain amount of social distress, and people coming and joining in, not because of the gardening side really, but because they just wanted something to do, and just, you know, whatever reasons, social things, connection things, but is at the same time you're growing food, so you're actually creating something of value. And what we realized was, although we created the garden to grow food and build soil and support wildlife and biodiversity, how we were seen as a community, the community source was a place for reconnection, where people who were lost souls or people coming back from rehabilitation, or maybe they've been in prison or whatever, they could reconnect with society again through the space, and a space in which we were creating value because we were growing food. And we actually had a couple of very good horticulture people there, so we grew a lot of food, and we grew fruits, and we started to preserve it. And 5 years ago, or 6 years ago now, I stopped working there, but the project itself has carried on because it's clearly meeting physical and social needs within the community. So yeah, there you go. So that's I don't know if that's any use at all, but that's sort of my sort of big picture lecture of a sense of how it all hangs together. Please do ask questions.
Yeah, I can see now why it was necessary. So this totally different angle of the whole thing. So because my basic question was around the ethical investments. And now, so this is the framework. So this is the foundation for it to understand why and how and why that way. I'm scrolling now back to my questions. I copied them here from the messenger I sent to you.
Oh, good.
They were a bit more, let me see, a couple of definitions, and I can see I haven't copied all of my questions. Never mind. So there are some basic definitions like asset class and bonds and benchmark and direct impact investments and equity, guilds, if I pronounce it correctly.
Guilds, yeah.
And then I have heard it 1,000 times, this ISA, but it just doesn't seem to go into my head.
So these are financial products that of which they come in all shape and sizes. And so governments can create gilts and bonds of it. It's a way in which they're borrowing money, and they'll have it at a fixed rate of interest, or it'll have a lifetime yield, and they're tradable as well. So you can, if you want to cash those in, you can sell it to a trader. But yeah, so that becomes beyond the levels of detail I really understand about exactly. I understand what these things are, but as to, I think, yeah. So kind of, yeah. So if you gave me a long list there, and I only thought of a couple of them. So remind me.
Shall I? Okay. So the first one was asset class.
So that's just a type. It means like an asset is a resource or something which you hopefully will hold value, and so there'll be different classes of value. I don't know if exactly say different asset classes, but that means I don't know exactly what that means, like property or certain kinds of bonds or something. I don't know.
And then the next one was bonds, and it was with every definition is more about just having some more background, because I read them in the glossary of Triodos.
Yeah.
But because I didn't have any education or class in economics, so these concepts I can deal with them, but they are, so unless I learned something to deepen all these connections between the different concepts, I think it will remain a bit alien to me, because that's not why.
One of the things that happened in the banking crash, and it was when I started to realize that you could create. So there's a need for investment. And that's one of the key functions of money is, okay, I'm fit and young now, I'm creating a surplus, but I'm going to need that maybe in later years. And across the whole of society, we need this kind of deferred payment. And that's, to me, is a really, really interesting challenge, actually, is how you might do that in an ethical way. But simplistically, so one way that we do it is we buy into certain kinds of assets, which is like buying a house. And we've been encouraged, again, which I don't actually think is a good thing, but we've been encouraged to see houses as something which you build up equity in it. So as you pay down the mortgage, some of that value of the house now belongs to you. And then obviously, if the value of that asset inflates because the housing market rises, then you have more equity. So you can then leverage that equity. You could then go and say, well, look, I've got 50, my house is worth 250 grand, but I still owe 200 to the bank, but 50 is for me. You could maybe borrow money against that and then use that to invest into a different kind of asset class away from housing. All of that sort of, yeah. So maybe if that helps at all with it. But that's what those terms mean. And a very, very important thing so in our ethical housing sector is we look for someone has small housing co-op like us. We would never get a sort of a 90% mortgage or something like that. The best we'd ever could get is 70%, and we'd get that on a business plan. So to start a new housing co-op, you've got to find at least 30% of the value of the property in cash from private investors. And one way that you might do that is to sell a bond. So you might say to someone, we'll give you a fair rate of interest, but over a certain number of years, because I don't want you to, if you go to invest into a house and then 6 months later you want the money out again, that's a challenge. So you might fix it over a period of time. So sometimes bonds have usually that term, it means it's something that has like a lifetime that you're committing over a period of time. And the longer the time, maybe the more generous the interest rate. Or I don't know. These things are always a trade-off. And the other thing to think about in like investing is the idea of liquidity, and that means how quickly you could turn your investment back into cash again. And usually the less liquid the asset, the more it is tied up in, it's hard to quickly sell. Again, is you would seek a higher rate of return for that, because it's a more, but you're taking a long-term view of something. And again, that's very important in the economy in different layers, is that people are sort of, I guess if you've got millions of investors, it all averages out, but what you need is a certain level of commitment over time to be able to plan and do long scale projects. So I think that, I don't know whether my critique of it all is a bit harsh, but I just sort of think that, just about most banks don't have the interest of the investors at heart. Most of those institutions, and a lot of these products like ISAs and things like that are, I don't know. That's not the direction I'm looking in. It's not necessarily seeking the biggest financial return. You've got to seek. So again, remember, we're not seeking money. We're trying to facilitate meeting needs of communities and societies and of the environment. And so we need to invest in those things that enable us to meet our needs, not to seek necessarily profit for its own sake.
I remember that one of my questions was that what's the difference between the ethical investment and the normal investment? And I think you just answered this question.
Yes.
And then the other one was that, so in very practical terms, that can you describe maybe in more general terms or some examples of investment for the purpose of pension as an ethical investment, or some.
Well, so the interesting thing about pensions is I want to put the money in now, but I don't want it back for 30 years or however a long period of time. So that's a very special kind of investment. And there are ethical funds that you can just go to and buy whatever it is, financial products. They have all sorts of fantastic names, but basically you can imagine that they so what they did, one of the things that they created created the market bubble was, what they realized was that in the old days, you'd go to your building society, you'd borrow £25,000, you'd buy a little house, and you'd pay them back £500 a month as your mortgage, and something like that. What's happened now in the modern era is you go to your bank and you take out a mortgage to buy your house, and then the next day the bank sells that mortgage to someone else. And that mortgage then gets sold to some kind of hedge fund or investment fund. And what they do is that they layer them all together. They put thousands and thousands and thousands of people's mortgages all together in a big pile, and then slice it all up and sell those as investment products. So a lot of, if you think of these financial products, whether they are, whatever crazy names they give them, is in some ways they're a conglomeration of a whole bunch of financial assets like people's mortgages or credit card debt or student debt or car loans or any way that people have interacted with the economy. And then they layer them up and slice them out and sell those as investment products. So that's a way in which you, in 25 years time, you might be to get your money back with a nice, bonus as well. But then they got greedy, and what they started doing was diluting the value of those things by putting loads of toxic bad debt underneath, some good debt and hiding it. And if they averaged it out enough, it seemed to disappear. So what I said before is that when you link things together in a global economy, it kind of averages out the peaks and troughs, and that can be a stabilizing thing. But what they did in the global economy was that they linked everything to everything else in a way in which it then becomes massively unstable, because it's not thousands of little interactions. It's all one big system. And that's created a seesaw effect that basically collapse the world economy, and I can only think that it'll happen again. So, and say collapse doesn't mean everything falls apart. It means things contract. So you have to invest into things that are real, and the things that are really real are soil and community. That's the way that I think about it as a permaculture person. I think that, again, if you go back to land, labor, and capital, as if you've got organized people and some fertile soil, we can start growing food and creating resources again. So those are actually the most valuable things. So we need to look to also the institutions that facilitate healthy soil and strong communities and try and invest in them. So Triodos would be a window to think, because they're a bank who are trying to do that, but you can get involved more with specific. This is where I don't know, because I don't have any money, and I don't. But so I'm really interested in these energy co-ops. I think because if you buy a piece of plant that creates energy ecologically efficiently, there's always going to be a demand for that, and over time, obviously you've got to pay off the capital investment, blah blah blah. But over time, there'll be a payback. So that's the kind of thing that's worth investing into, and there are cooperatives that help facilitate that. So like banks that funnel money into those directions, and I'm very interested in seeing many more of those kinds of institutions come into existence, because I don't think there's many out there, and I think that's what we need next. Yeah. Any more questions?
I haven't studied further that website, but there was one, I could look for the name, and I sent you also by messenger, and there were quite a few options for investment, and that would be, for example, something where I wouldn't know where to start and how to decide.
Well, the next thing might be good to speak to someone at Triodos and see what they. I suppose maybe you have done. As I say, the bank. I mean, they're the only bank. So I jumped the section of the lecture about the credit multiplier effect, about how banks lend out money that they don't have, but the same money can get lent out multiples of times, and which again is part of how the exposure happened in the financial collapse. But Triodos don't do that. They don't lend out money that they don't have. They don't multiply it up. So they protected from contagion. If the market goes suddenly wrong, they haven't lent the same money out 35 times, which is what had happened in the consolidated debt obligations market, or whatever it was that happened in 2009. Because it was mortgages and no one ever defaults on their mortgage, in theory, it was leveraged enormous amounts of times. And so that's how they lost trillions of dollars.
Well, it's good to know that that's a basic difference, that Triodos doesn't lend money which doesn't exist.
Yes. That's absolutely right.
I have found the name of this website I was referring to. It's Crowdcube. Have you known about this website before?
Cube, no. That sounds interesting though, and I think they say there's a lot of innovation going on around the edges between crowdfunding and cryptocurrencies and building these functional relationships. That's what I'm trying to say, trying to make you see it as an interconnected system. That's the way that money works. It's not isolated. It's all connected somehow. And
absolutely mega fun.
Is it good? Okay.
Cheers.
And what we're trying to do is to get, if you like, the money, the resource, the honey, flowing and nourishing the parts of the system that benefit all of us, not just the profit chasing, let's sell hamburgers or whatever, throwaway fashion and disposable consumerism, which is obviously the thing that we have to get away from. Unfortunately, there's more money to be made in disposable consumerism than there is in building soil and building community, but we have to invest into those things. So, you've got to kind of ask yourself, you've got to also, so you need to think a little bit more about, I don't know, what do you need the money to do for you? as in what kind of return or what kind of time plan that you have, or you know, I don't know what your circumstances, but whether, like, so yeah, I'm not a big fan of speculating on the housing market, and I don't believe in buy-to-let properties and stuff like that. I don't think that helps anyone. It might help you, but I don't think it helps the system. It's actually a real question. Imagine if you were some kind of investment manager, and you had billions to invest. Is what would you put it in today? Because the stock market is completely overinflated, and then the market, housing market is completely overinflated. Many resources, so many sort of so another asset class would be commodities. You could buy gold and silver. That's another asset class. And the thing is, again, that market again is so manipulated. It's not real. And the gold market contains lots of gold that hasn't been found yet. It's a bit like the Yappies stone money. Some of that's still at the bottom of the sea, but we're speculating that it might come into the market into the future. It's so we go back to what is real. Community is real, human connections is real, and so what are the institutions that facilitate that? So you know, I don't if they don't exist, we need to create them. Yeah, I don't feel like I've answered any of your questions. I've just given you a big long spiel, but I hope it's useful.
Yeah, it gives a perspective. It gives a kind of mindset. So I noticed that you come from a totally different point, or how do you say it in English?
Starting point.
Yeah, as the other financial things I have heard. They are very useful as well, but they are for other reasons.
Yeah. Well, so I'm coming more from the ecology sort of thinking about side of things, but I'm also really fascinated, you know, is this intersection somewhere between ecology and economics, and it's a question about how we meet our needs without damaging the ecology of the planet in a way in which is harmonious, and can we actually do that? Is it even possible? I mean, I actually think that it is, but I'm not quite sure what the mechanism is that becomes the prevailing methodology, because the asset strippers are winning right now.
I just put down these websites.
Yeah.
Green.
I wonder what happened to positive money. I used to, there was oh yeah, and there's a new economics foundation. I think there's Radical Roots is the housing co-op network. That was specifically the people that we work with to start our first housing co-op, and that was probably the most life-changing thing that's happened to me, was moving from being just a tenant to being in a co-op. And realizing that you could borrow money as a enterprise, as a organization, not just as an individual. I'm finding more and more good economic things actually online now as well. I think there is. I mean, there are discussions out there. There are people who are thinking about these things, but I would really like to, you know, find more, because I think that we're kind of intrigued, because I started out from studying economics to going as far away from it as you could possibly get, to realizing that it is still, it's the thing that we need to resolve. Economics is the problem, so therefore it's also the solution. If we could get this right, we make the right decisions, we put resources in the right place, we suddenly start running everything in the other direction, and we create what I would call a regenerative economy, something that builds soils and plants forests and creates strong communities that have food security, and that's what this model is supposed to do.
Just back to the beginning of your talk or presentation, where you explained the definition or the concept or the word of oiko, and I have found it interesting for two ways, because so I didn't know where are you going with this, and then it just a really pleasant surprise to me. So where we ended, and I'm quite sure that I will now remember much more because I have heard the story for it.
Good.
So the Earthling house. And the other one is that I remember that when I lived in Germany, I used the so-called oiko credit, and now it makes sense why they call it oiko.
Yes. It's important to know where these words come from, because they have meaning. There's something physical and tangible about it. And I like this idea that the decisions that you make at the hearth is what affects both the internal world of the home and the external world of the farmers and markets and producers. And that's, again, this interaction between ecology and economics, of meeting needs and understanding we're part of this planetary system.
So, well, thank you very much for all the websites, books, recommendations, and
you're welcome.
Principles. I made some notes.
Great, cool, good. And I say I'll let you digest all of that, and then let's see what comes from it.
It is quite possible that we will be in touch.
I'll look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah.